He wound up on.
Hello? Oh, good. You can hear us. I am Jim Yardley from the failing New York Times. I want to thank everybody for coming. We're here obviously to talk about free trade, and I was thinking this morning that not so long ago, the whole phrase free trade, for many people was sort of benign. It was taken for granted, certainly at the multinational level and other things. And it was the centerpiece of the era we live in. And now, obviously, in many areas of the world, it is part of a populist political backlash, maybe not even just a populist backlash. It has helped put Donald Trump in the White House. We see dramatic political and economic change occurring. So we have a great panel, and I guess I want to just frame the very first question in the broadest way possible with Marisa, which is what went wrong?
Where to start? Where to start? First of all, I have to say that perhaps I don't know about my colleagues, but I have to just say now that I'm not in favor of the free trade model. So I don't know if I would be alone in this position or not. But I think that part of the model of free trade is one of the dimensions which is going wrong, in the wrong direction. And to answer to the question of this panel, I think if is free trade free? No, it isn't.
Why not?
Because I don't see it. I never saw in any part of the world any kind of innovation or definition of policy, even towards free trade, which didn't have at least an indirect intervention from states or from public authorities or institutions. So directly or indirectly is not free, is dependent on the policy making. And there's this idea that if everybody is able to export more, to open the markets, then we have a better world. It's simply impossible to occur, because if everybody sells more, then there's no mathematical equation that can enable that everybody will win. In order that some win, the others have to lose. And I think this is one of the major dimensions which is not filling the gap between developed countries and developing countries. And so I see it as a major problem, and I don't see that we come out of this if we move in the direction of the free trade agreements. They are not free at all. They are like a kind of politicized brand, but they are not free at all. And they are defined to be like they are, and to generate inequality and not the well-being or a fair trade across the universe. So that's my main concern. Of course, I'm not against international trade. I'm not against the fact that countries should cooperate. But this model seems to me to be a model which is biased and is far from being proved in reality with facts. On the contrary, I would say that facts deny what is being sold as the miracles of the free trade, which in fact is not in our hands by God's will. It's because there were political decisions after the 80s by mainly the World Bank and the IMF, and after 95 by the World Trade Organization. And then the governments adopted it and make the agreements. But it's not by God's will, it's by political will.
Sorin, well, you're a free trader. How do you take that?
Yes, I'm a cautious free trader. I think there are two fundamental root causes in terms of what went wrong, and I would look at it from the standpoint of the West, or the Western world, which built the liberal order after the Second World War. The first challenge is what I would term the rise of the rest, so the emerging economies who at the beginning of globalization we were treating as opportunities and now have become rivals and competitors. And of course the case of China is just the most famous, but it's not only China. So for the first time, I think since pre-modern times, the Western world is being pushed back economically and politically and technologically at on a global scale. So since Enlightenment, this is the first time we have this phenomenon, and trade policy is one of the arenas, or maybe the most important arena, in which we need to absorb this shock. The second fundamental root cause, I would say, is the huge power amassed by corporations, which have taken advantage of globalization to build scale in the global village. And in some areas, of course, there are frictions between this huge power amassed by these entities and what we would call our democracies. There is friction, and we need to address that. So our trade policy had to integrate, to absorb these two major challenges in ways that would allow us, for instance, to address the issue of competitiveness, but also of upward social mobility. I mean, if we have a core issue in the Western world, is not only the erosion of middle classes, but is the poor perspectives of upward social mobility, is the hope for tomorrow that is endangered rather than the wealth in absolute terms only. So I do believe that poses a significant problem. So what we had to do is to respond to the social anxieties that were directly or indirectly induced by these two mega trends, and you have everything from the unions being worried because many of our industries are delocalizing, to our companies being worried that China is buying our high-tech companies or is becoming creative itself. And it's sort of squeezing out, even in fair ways, economic substance out of the Western world. And we need we had to reinvent our trade policies and also think on a global scale. And I think this is why the Doha round, for instance, at the WTO has failed so far, because a lot of its logic predates these new realities. So we have a fundamental mismatch between the economic and political realities of the world and trade policy as we used to have. The good news, as far as I'm concerned, is that in Europe we have been, despite all the imperfections and actually due to the debates that we have had, we have been able to upgrade our trade policy and to integrate many of these new concerns and anxieties and move towards a consensus on something that is taking shape as a new trade policy, new trade narrative, new trade consensus, which I believe, unfortunately, the US has so far at least been failing to do.
Arancha, what do you think?
Well, first, I think that trade is not a zero-sum game. You basically export what the world wants and you import what the world knows. And you can import as much and export as much, and everyone can import as much and export as much. There is no limits, and it's not zero-sum game. And I think it's important because I sometimes hear some politicians say that for them, for example, for them to work in trade, they've got to not have a trade deficit, for example. They only can have a surplus. And this is where I agree with Marisa. If everyone has a surplus, it's going to be a problem, which doesn't mean that trade is a zero-sum game. So let's just first clarify that. Then I think trade has suffered from three myths. From myth number one, that goes, it's about free trade. And there is no such thing as free trade. There are lots of limitations to trade for good reasons, for safety, for security, for precaution. These exceptions that limit trade for good reasons. Mm-hmm. So I think we would do well in not to equate trade with a world with no rules, which is what free trade sometimes entails. Two, the second myth is that by using trade protectionism, we're going to protect jobs. And we know now that trade protectionism will not help us protect jobs. Because whatever we do on the trade protectionist side is constantly eroded by technological change, which obliges our economies to structural transformations that makes our jobs suffer and also creates other jobs in the meantime. So it's not by protecting trade and erecting trade barriers that we will preserve jobs. Myth number three, that the health of international trade and the benefits or costs of international trade are solely due to international trade. This is another myth. Take the European Union, same trade rules, same trade policy, same trade, but not same results of international trade. It depends a lot on how you combine trade opening with domestic policies. And it is more and more about the quality of the domestic policies. And if you do not invest in those domestic policies, which is what I see happening in some countries, then the results are an equal distribution of the benefits of growth, and therefore the whole responsibility is put on international trade. So trade is a means, but if you don't use this tool called trade in a proper way with other domestic policies, it's not going to result in a better opportunities for all your citizens. It may end up what it looks like in some of the our northern economies, which is lots of benefits for 1% and lots of costs for 99%.
John?
So I think you've got a pretty interesting global context in which to have this conversation today, right? You've got international institutions that, for the whole post-war period, were able to deliver kind of coherent governance, or at least an attempt at coherent governance, or convene a conversation about coherent governance, now in disarray, right? Instead of a G20 or a G8, you could have what we might call like a G0, right? A world where no one's in charge. You've got countries where every nation's for themselves, right? They're viewing the world through a nationalist lens, not through a supranational lens. Even the most successful international organizations or supranational organizations like the EU have questions about their composition going forward. So expecting an issue like trade to be resolved at the international and multilateral level when institutions are deadlocked and fading in importance, I think is unreasonable. So if nobody's steering the ship, you drop down to the national level and have to ask yourself, okay, well, are there countries that are pushing in the right direction on trade policy? Are there countries that actually have proactive agendas to achieve this? Unfortunately, in the period that we're in, you have a kind of a different type of populism than you've had previously, and it's affecting trade in a different way than it has in the past, right? You've always had populism, right? For me to sit here and tell you that there are people that lose from trade and that those people vote, that's nothing new. You could ask for your money back and walk out, right? That's very simple. What I think is different is that those folks who are losing from trade are increasingly becoming the marginal voters in a lot of these elections, right? So politicians are campaigning towards them. They're being micro-targeted. They're being mobilized, right? Donald Trump's talking points against trade policy were no different than Senator Obama talking about how nobody wanted a $1 t-shirt if they didn't have a job, right? These are standard talking points. It's just that those voters matter a lot more. As a result, it's having a chilling effect on those who are proponents for trade. Businesses are silent, right? They're afraid to lobby in favor of trade or be perceived to be in favor of trade because, because half the population and increasingly important parts of their consumer base don't necessarily share their point of view anymore, so they stay silent. But there's always this metaphor in trade policy of a bicycle that if you don't keep pedaling forward, the bicycle might tip over, right? That was sort of you could have a big debate in trade circles about whether the bicycle would stand still. And what we're seeing now is actually the tipping over of it. I'd end with one final point in how we think about it. This is a very Western dynamic that we're discussing, right? Free trade is absolutely the name of the game for the new China-led international architecture that's being built in front of us. So if I talk about an absence of global leadership, Xi Jinping just told us by 2050 there will be a new global leader, right? And what does the Chinese version of trade look like? Is it fair trade, or is it actually just lowest common denominator free trade? That's going to be a big force that a lot of these economies are going to have to deal with, and their political economy is going to have to absorb.
So where does the leadership come from in the West? Where's it going to come from now? I'm curious.
Where's the leadership is coming?
We're saying there's an abdication of leadership in the West, and there's Xi Jinping. I spent a lot of time in China, sitting and waiting. How does the West recover, or do we not think of it in those terms?
I think that honestly we should be, the world should be prepared to have more enlightened leaderships when it comes to this domain, which is not happening in the moment. Mm-hmm. So I think it's more about a fight which is a major concern of developed countries rather than a question of trying to have a really and concrete model for the entire society. So where is the leadership coming from? I was trying to avoid to say it, but sometimes it's not coming from the political side. It's not coming from the representatives of people. The majority of time is perhaps coming from some groups of interests which doesn't necessarily represent the common interests or neither fair approach to these dimensions. So in some of these issues, politics has been kidnapped, and we need to rescue it again. And so I think that where is the leadership coming from? It would be a very, very nice question if we would have wonderful answers and transparent answers to give to people, but the majority of time, people don't want to be so transparent in the way to say where is the leadership and the real power coming from in order to define this politics.
Sorin, the idea, the title of this speech was a revised trade consensus of this panel. You were talking earlier about how the EU has looked at this differently from the United States, and you were saying you thought it did a better job. If we're not going to have one gigantic Western policy, what is possible? How can we make it better? To make it more fair. I mean, we've talked about the things we're seeing in workers in Bangladesh who are making products for people in the West. How do we make it more fair and make it work?
Okay, I mean that's actually a good starting point on the leadership issue and what I would define as the new trade narrative that the EU has been shaping for itself. And on the Bangladesh issue, one of the new, I mean, the things that we obsess about recently in the EU is to make sure we integrate in all our trade agreements all the core ILO conventions, which include conventions on collective bargaining. I mean, you have the fundamental worker rights as enshrined in these 8 core ILO conventions, which we do try to promote, and actually it will become compulsory. It would be politically impossible for us in the European Parliament to vote on a trade agreement that does not treat at least the substance of these conventions very seriously. So it's one of the areas in which our narrative has been evolving, and I have a whole list of other areas. We have transformed the private arbitration systems, ISDS. Of course, some colleagues might say it's not enough what we have done,
No,
but we have shaped it to be now much closer to what you would have as a normal court system, a public court system. I think that is part of this transformation, and there has been leadership from all sections of the Brussels bubble, to put it in those terms. I have myself been involved in this. The Commission has been involved in this. Things are evolving indeed. We have been open and sensitive.
So we're at a tech conference, and the example I just cited had to do with garment manufacturing, which is sort of a classic supply chain. What about tech in this? What industry has benefited more from this era than the one we're sitting in? It's sort of created a whole new global elite. How does tech fit into this, Arancha?
Well, to me, tech is a huge part of this transformation that we are seeing in our economies, for the good and for the bad.
Right.
It's disrupting incredibly business models that affect lots of people and lots of people's jobs, but it's also creating amazing opportunities that didn't exist today. Let me tell you one. For example, electronic commerce that today represents 13% of world trade in goods, $25 trillion. The fastest growing part of this trade is B2C, business to consumer. So it's allowing micro companies to sell directly to consumers without intermediation, which means they capture a greater part of the value. So there is the good and the bad. The question here, like everywhere else, is where do we find the balance? And I think that the balance requires 3 ingredients. First, that we keep markets open, because that's the guarantee that competitiveness, productivity will continue to foster the strengths of our economies. 2, that we invest in domestic policies, and tech requires massive investments in domestic policies, in particular in education, skills, and connectivity, soft and hard. And without that, we risk basically replicating the divide that exists today in our economies with a digital divide. And 3, we require more international cooperation and not less. Less international cooperation to solve issues that have a global dimension essentially fragments the playing field. These 3 ingredients, whether it is for the online or for the offline, for the tech or for the 20th century economy, is the 3 ingredients that, in my view, need to be part of the new consensus.
May I just say?
Marisa has to leave, unfortunately.
I have to leave. I'm so sorry, because this is running delayed, and the panel was supposedly finished now.
I know.
So I have to run. It's just by coincidence, but it's because I'm hosting in Brussels, starting today, the European Forum for Social and Solidarity Economy. So I have to leave, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
It
Thank
was
you
really
very
nice
much, Marisa.
meeting you.
Thank you.
Sorry to leave.
No, no problem. Go rush to the airport. It's good to meet you. Sean, where were we talking? Tech.
We're talking about tech and trade. You know, it's quite an interesting dynamic, right? I mean, governments. It's pretty straightforward that governments are behind the curve on how to regulate technology, and now we're going to talk about the transmission of technology and data across borders. Governments couldn't possibly get up the curve as fast as some of the folks here pushing that curve forward. So what are some of the solutions? What can happen? Well, number one, we've got some problems on the horizon, right? We're seeing companies go straight to governments to negotiate deals. So Jack Ma gave a big presentation, called for a WTO 2.0 and EWTO, didn't actually explain anything about what that would mean. And then 2 years later, he's negotiating deals directly with the government of Mexico to create digital platforms. So what does it mean for governments when companies are bigger than some of the countries that they're negotiating with, have more leverage, and see these failing institutions or institutions that can't deliver for them as a bad avenue and an avenue that dilutes their message, and they start going straight to government, and the government's behind the curve. So I think number one, you've got this dimension where companies are going to exploit and create leverage by the fact that government's behind the curve. Number two, I think you do have an onus on companies to lend some of that intelligence to governments, right? Create programs to second some of their folks to governments so they can stay up the curve. The financial sector has been great at this throughout history, where there's kind of a transfer of information as financial innovation moves forward. The governments can keep up by bringing people in-house, and they move back and forth. We need to start thinking about that with respect to tech and trade, because it's not possible. And then third, I think also we just have to be very clear about when we're dealing with trade and when we're dealing with everything else, because the complexity of a lot of our negotiations end up weighing them down. So think about the TransPacific Partnership negotiations, right? You had over 24 chapters, some of which were about trade in oranges, some of which are about data transfers. And you're going to negotiate all of that with 12 countries, different levels of development and political cycles that are moving at different speed, and get it all done. You can't do it, right? So I think on some level you need to move some of these issues out of the trade negotiation and resolve them in a specialist in the specialist venue, and keep trade about trade policy. It doesn't mean that we want to bulldoze workers, or that we want to kind of take some of the social issues out of the trade debate, but it does mean acknowledging that that complexity often leaves us with nothing to take home because the deals can't actually get done.
I want to reply to that, because I think this is a bit of a false dilemma. The issues need to be tackled. If they find a good vehicle to tackle them called Trans-Pacific Partnership, why not? The fact that it's a Trans-Pacific trade agreement doesn't mean that the experts on data flows are not going to be the ones crafting the provisions on data flows. I think what we have is a failure on governments to understand that there are certain parts of the economic life that require some sort of regulatory framework, be it principles, be it rules, be it in whichever form. But they can abdicate, because the answer otherwise would be that companies would do that themselves. And then governments are going to be running behind the curve on regulations that companies would have privatized for them. And on that note, let's watch very attentively what happens with the TPP -1.
-1, yeah.
-1. They like to call it TPP 11, but it's TPP -1. Let's see what happens.
Sorin, on this issue of massive multinationals negotiating directly as opposed to kind of elbowing out governments. Our government, the EU is a different beast, but what sort of a situation does this create?
Yes, we do have the advantage of size, and we do tend even to be blamed by major multinationals when they, for instance, they are fined by Brussels for what we see as uncompetitive behavior. We have a huge debate these very days in Brussels on how to deal with data flows, and also in the context of privacy issues. Should it be in trade agreements, or should it be separate agreements outside the trade framework itself? There are two schools of thought in Brussels. consensus is emerging that they somehow need to be packaged together. They need to be together, but we still do not know. I mean, our heads of state and government would prefer to have this in trade agreements. The European Commission, or parts of it, seems to prefer to have it as a separate track, really taking care of privacy issues. Also in the context when we have the new General Data Protection Regulation of the EU coming into force next year. So what we have created is a great regime in terms of privacy, as far as I'm concerned, which the major corporations of this world will have to accept. And now we are working to integrate that into or together with our trade policy in the future trade agreements that we are negotiating. For the moment, with Japan, we have a separate track for data protection. So this is very much part of this new consensus taking shape and being built, but it's one of the areas we're not quite there yet on the nitty-gritty of exactly how to do the fine-tuning.
So we've about out of time, but Arancha, I want to let you have the last word. And I'm curious, I saw a statistic that said 70% of Americans in the United States think that trade with foreign countries, maybe it was from you, Sean, is a good thing. And 50% support free trade. Yet the politics are going in the opposite direction. How do we get in a world where free trade became something synonymous with the elites, and the politics backlash? What needs to change?
Well, I think we have to be careful not to become obsessed with what's happening in the United States. Because if this is what's happening in the United States, I was in Asia last week, Japan, Korea, and the world looks very different.
Oh, very different.
I spent my time in Africa. The world looks very different. So the U.S. seems to be a bit of an issue at the moment.
Right.
It's to me the big question is whether it's a blip or whether it's a trend. If it's a blip, then the answer is a little bit different than if it is a trend. But in my view, in the case of the U.S., there is one very clear message that any politician needs to hear, is that the domestic policies in the U.S. need to change. Domestic policies need to change in education, in skills, in infrastructure, in healthcare, in safety nets. That is what will allow the US to leverage the enormous force that it has on the industrial side, on the technology side, by making it work for 99% of Americans. That's the answer, not trade protectionism. That's what I take for the US. But again, that's very US specific, and then there is the rest of the world.
I know. Well, that does it. Thank you very much to our panel and to Marisa, who's left, and thank you all very much.
Thank you.